Off with the baseball hat. Oh, you have one question there?
I came here to get some information
Sure.
about, you talked a lot about some of the things you're doing.
Yes.
And I appreciate that with the Bay and whatever.
Sure.
I'm really interested. I'm getting lots of literature now,
Right.
and people calling me on the phones and I'm going crazy.
Be careful, be careful, robocalls.
No, that's what I want to know about. You know, I hear that you were the deciding vote in the MTA tax legislation
Sure.
that passed, and a lot of people are very happy about that.
Right.
And I'd like to know what your side of the story
Sure,
is.
sure.
I'd also like to know something about your idea on, property taxes are going through the roof, and how do you feel about capping,
Okay.
property taxes?
Sure.
And,
Yep. Good. In one of the great things about state government, what I love about New York State, because of the diversity of its people, demographically and geographically, the diversity in our state. For those of us who have devoted our public lives to public service, some through the police department, others through firematics and the like, some of us through elective office, really love to get involved in a whole host of issues. And unfortunately, there are those that have attempted to reduce all of state government to the MTA employer payroll tax. And I think that does a disservice to the issue, and also I think it's also an insult to the public. Because quite frankly, there's a whole host of issues that we have to confront as New Yorkers and as Long Islanders and folks from this area of our state. The way that I like to speak about the MTA employer payroll tax is similar to my time when I was a cable supervisor, where I used to say quite often, I was the first change in 45 years there. In New York State Senate, it's the first change in leadership in 45 years. And we're not going to be able to reverse 40-some-odd years of poor stewardship in just 1 or 2 years. Additionally, we inherited a whole host of problems in Brookhaven Town. And that's fine, that's why I went to be problem solvers. Same holds true in the New York State Senate. We were saddled with a whole bunch of problems in the former majority. Primary among which, and literally within the first month and a half of office, dropped on our laps was the imminent problems at the Metropolitan Transportation Authority. And so it was left to us to try to untangle a mess that was created over 30 to 40 years of out of control management. And what we found out in the short time that we were there, that over the period of over 10 to 15 years, there were a series of controller reports that outlined to the state senators before my time all the problems that were occurring at the MTA and how there was a growing disparity between revenues and expenses, and that they had to come to grips with it. Well, those before my time didn't come to grips with it. Or they did in a way, but not in a responsible way. What they decided to do is several things that we had to try to solve and try to address. When they had these problems back in the early 2000s, the majority of that time will now say they're the anti-taxers. Well, they decided to have a portion of the sales tax that we all pay, as opposed to the employer tax, part of the sales tax to be used to pay for the MTA. That's sales tax is the most regressive tax extant in the land. That wasn't enough. Several years later, they decided to make home ownership more expensive by also placing the mortgage receipt tax, a portion of which would go to the MTA. So put it on our our mortgage taxes to pay for that, and on commercial properties as well. All right? So they give them all this money, all right? But they didn't do something that we did. That when we had to address this issue, we also required a series of forensic audits to take place. But there's also a third thing that was done during that period of time before we got there, that the former majority allowed to happen. And it's one of the basic tenets of prudent management, whether it's in the public sector or the private sector. Something that you never do, and something that we reversed in Brookhaven Town. And that is the former Senate allowed the MTA to capitalize their operating costs, so that in a period of years, they increased their indebtedness by over $1 billion. So finally, this whole house of cards finally fell apart, and they say timing is everything, folks, just as we came into office. So when this report was given to us early in my tenure, in our first 2 months of office, different from those before us, as we were different from Brookhaven Town, We weren't going to practice what they practice. We weren't going to engage in malpractice. We were going to take a hard look at this and try to match real expenses with real revenues. So we had to make a very, very difficult choice, and one that some are now are attempting to try to get partisan points about, but quite frankly, that's going to blow up in their face, because they created these problems that we're trying to solve. So what we had to decide at that point, and it was 32, I was the deciding vote. Any one of the 32 could be considered the deciding vote. We decided that we had to do something to address this issue. Otherwise, as we've seen now, some of the problems, right? There would have been complete chaos if nothing was done. We would have had neighbors who use the MTA on a regular basis see their rates go up, fares go by over 35%, like that. We would have seen not just 1 or 2 trains shut down, but a whole host of trains and lines that would have shut down. And what we would have also seen, and it's very important, remember, this is some planners in the room now, and we all know this is an island. We only have 15 miles wide. We have about 125,000 commuters on a daily basis from Long Island, and others who use it on a sporadic basis. But we have hundreds of thousands who use that particular service. If these expenses went so high, we would have tens of thousands more cars on the roads. And we know how congested it is now. It would be that much worse. So we had to make a decision, which was to infuse that authority with additional funding so they could keep servicing the public. But my vote was conditioned on several things. One was that I had the commitment from our leadership that we would revisit the payroll tax, number one. And number two, to make sure that we would require audits to be done and forensic audits to be undertaken. And to the great credit of Comptroller DiNapoli, he has undertaken several of those audits so far. And I'll be happy to send the Executive Board a copy of the executive summary of the report from September 7th that outlined the hundreds of millions of dollars in overtime abuse that occurred. And I'll say it here for the record, I'm a strong believer in the union movement. I believe that the unions have been part of the fabric of this country and helped to create the middle class and will help maintain the middle class. There are, parenthetically, there are forces at work in my race who come from other parts of the country that want to destroy the union movement in this state. That's another discussion for another time. The DeMints of the world, the Cobans of the world, and the armies of the world, and some from Virginia as well. But I will say this, that when we passed it, the Comptroller issued his reports. It's going to help us focus like a laser beam on the problems of the MTA. And we're also doing something else, that with us in the majority, we are holding the State Senate, which is the upper house, has the appointment authority to the MTA, not the Assembly, but the State Senate. We're going to do something different than did our predecessors who were in control. We're holding MTA potential appointees to a higher standard. And when you think of the likes of Patrick Floyd and a few others who are very, very not only ethical but highly competent and professional men and women, we're going to appoint people to the MTA board. We're going to hold that management's feet to the fire. And we're very, very confident about that. The final piece is, and it already has received bipartisan support with Fred Thiel sponsoring the bill in the Assembly, because one of the real constructive criticisms was the fact that at the very least, and this is how we're going to revisit the issue in the upcoming legislative session, is to greatly reduce, hopefully leading to its elimination, but the bill that I have in the Senate and that Fred Thiel has in the Assembly is that our proposal is to reduce by over 70% the employer payroll tax for Suffolk County, as well as for the 4 counties north of Westchester. And we think that's a very responsible approach because it will reduce it from 34 cents down to 9 with the expectation that it will be even lower as we go forward. But what's important about that is the recognition that mass transit, whether we like it or not, in the suburban region of our state is going to play a greater role in the movement of people within our given area. But by reducing it to a level that reflects, as I call it, a proportionate to the use of the service. So whereas in New York City it would still remain at 34 cents, because that's, they have a more, let's say, multimodal approach to transportation. For us out here, we have a significant reduction. And I have every confidence in the world, and I will receive assurances from the leadership in our House that we will approve this legislation in the next legislative session. So that gives you some background to it. It's something that, again, that's been on people's minds. But I also think that there are those at work that have exploited this issue for partisan purposes, trying to reduce all of state government to this one issue. It does a disservice to the issue, it does a disservice to us as New Yorkers, and also to all the challenges that confront us in the state legislature. As far as